going to talk to you today about hacking cognition, literally how to overclock your brain, more literally than some of you would like, I presume. But as Kobe said, my name is Jonan. I tend to linger on that last N a little bit because I'm frequently called Jonah, like Jonah in the whale. Also Jonas, like My Name is Jonas, the Weezer song. Neither of those are in fact accurate. My name is Jonan. Think Conan, but with a J. This image here is courtesy of one Josh Sullivan, good friend of mine. So in talking about hacking cognition, there are a couple of basics I want to cover first. These are pretty simple things that you've all heard before. Like, the goal today is for you to have some actionable steps that will help you improve your clarity of thought, your ability to think. And it's not a small thing to set out to do, but I think that we can all agree that as software engineers, it's a pretty important thing, right? If you can make a 1% improvement in your overall cognitive ability, it's 1% on every bit of code you will ever write again. So that's certainly worth your time, I think. So sleep, exercise, and eat. Who's been told to do those things before, like by everyone they've ever met, maybe their mother? Yes, it's true. These are things that are important, but nobody really has a clear picture of why. Specifically for brains, it matters. Sleep obviously helps us recharge. It helps us remember. While you sleep, you replay the things that happened during your events of your day. Our process is input and travel through your brain in various ways that we'll go into in a little bit. And as you sleep, you replay those things. Literally, you can watch the inputs replay as if you were watching it again live over and over again. And that's where your memories come from. They reinforce those chemical and physical changes that are happening in your brain to build memory and to learn. So Simon says sleep. You need 8 hours. You need 8 hours of sleep. But I'm a special snowflake. I can sleep for 5 hours and still program. You're wrong. You are a special snowflake to me. But when it comes to sleep, you need 8 hours. This is a little bit more for younger people, and sometimes older people can't manage 8 hours. Aim for 8 hours of sleep every night. You have a cumulative sleep that you build up when you get less than 8 hours. If you get 7 hours of sleep for 5 days in a row, your cognitive ability is significantly impacted. In fact, they took a teenager, a young woman who was at the head of her class. She was an honor roll student, and they put her into a 6-week sleep deprivation study where rather than her normal 8 hours of sleep, she got 7 hours every day for 6 weeks, and on the weekend, they let her make up 5 hours. So she lost 5 hours during the week, and on the weekend, she got to sleep an extra 5 hours between Saturday and Sunday, and she fell to the bottom of her non-sleep deprived peers by the end of the 6 weeks. So if you think that you're able to sleep 7 or 6 or 5 hours a night and still function at peak capacity, you're entirely wrong. So this Simon Says Sleep, the study that I am referencing here is one where they showed people, does anyone know what Simon Says the game was, like the little light thing and you push the lights, right? Remember the pattern? So there was a study where they took people who had been sleep deprived. They were students, and so they're working like these 16-hour days. They're barely getting their 7 hours of sleep. And they gave them a series of colored lights that they had to remember. It was only 3 or 4 lights. Split the group into 2, double-blind study. We've got sleep-deprived and not sleep-deprived. Show them the 3 or 4 lights. And the very interesting thing is that sleep-deprived people performed very quickly as compared to their peers. They went much faster. Positive impact to sleep deprivation, right? Except that they were wrong. They were wrong about the lights and 100% convinced that they were doing it better than everyone else. So think about that the next time you think you can sleep for 5 hours and be a better programmer. So exercise. This is a woman named Sabrina Segal. She got her PhD from UC Irvine, where she did a study on exercise for 6 minutes. That's all. Just give me 6 minutes of exercise after you do something, and you will be more likely to remember it. That's all it takes to improve your cognitive function, to improve the ability to learn new things. It actually amplifies the primacy effect, which is things that you learn in the beginning of a presentation. So I'm going to go back into that later, but basically beginning and end of something are much more memorable to you. All the stuff in between, basically where we're getting from now on in my presentation, will be forgotten. So exercise for 6 minutes will increase your primacy effect and allow you to remember things more effectively. And another interesting note about exercise is that this doesn't have to be a monumental task, right? I feel like a lot of developers I know tend to address things full bore. So we're going to pick up a new hobby, and we're going to spend $500 on that hobby today on Amazon, and then that's all we're going to do for 3 weeks, and then we'll get a new hobby, right? Some people are like that anyway. So exercise, when you think, oh, I'm going to start exercising, I'm going to start jogging 5 miles a day. I'm I'm going to exercise for 3 hours, wake up at 6 a.m., right? It's this monumental task, and it's a huge burden to overcome. But in reality, you only need a little bit of exercise every day. If you follow the prescribed 30 minutes a day, 3 days a week, you'll be fine. In fact, improvements between that and between people who moderately exercise 3 days a week and people who exercise intensely 6 days a week is only negligible as far as cognitive ability is concerned. Obviously, if you're a marathon runner and you run marathons every day for 6 days, that's awesome. You're going to be much healthier than I am in my 30-minute walks. But for cognitive ability, the equivalent gains will be seen with that amount of exercise. So you don't really need a huge amount of exercise. Don't consider this to be a giant project. Just get up in the morning and go for a walk, 30 minutes. And 6 minutes after you're trying to memorize something. So finally, eat healthy foods. This is a picture of your dentate gyrus. Actually, this is your hippocampus, but the dentate gyrus is inside there, the DG one in the middle. And there was a recent study that showed effectively that long-term spikes in blood sugar affect the functioning of the dentate gyrus. And this is one of the few places in the brain where neurogenesis happens in adults. So when you're children, there are a lot of key differences in your brain. There's a molecular switch, it turns out, that changes. A lot of people have heard of the language acquisition machine, maybe? Children can learn language really easily. And part of why they can do that is that their brains are more plastic. Their neuroplasticity is higher. They're more likely to be able to change their brains and to learn. And there's a switch that turns off. Recently, some MIT researchers turned it back on, which is fascinating. But for another talk. So the dentate gyrus in the elderly population is negatively impacted by long-term sugar spikes. So if you eat sweet foods or foods that are high in carbohydrates, those will spike your your blood sugar level, right? And your body will have an insulin response, and so your blood sugar goes like this, up high. Insulin comes into your bloodstream and pulls the glucose out of your bloodstream and puts it into your cells, and you get that kind of after sugar lull, right? And you go back and forth and back and forth. So the idea is to eat foods that feed you that glucose over a long period of time. And those are foods that are low in carbohydrates, protein, vegetables, things that are difficult to digest, basically. It will slow the absorption of that glucose into your bloodstream. So the is having a low glycemic load. So with glycemic load and glycemic index, lower numbers are better. On this screen here, you're not expected to see what's in the little chart there. I know that some of you are trying to squint and see, but this is a chart comparing glycemic index to glycemic loads. I've blown up the important part. Glycemic index is not what you actually want to use. On the right side, if you use glycemic index, then you could eat your weight in Wonder Bread, and it would be the same as eating watermelon for an equivalent amount, which is not the case, actually. Watermelon is much better for you than Wonder Bread. And glycemic load reflects that. So the way that they calculate glycemic load is to multiply the glycemic index by the amount of carbohydrates in 100 grams. So watermelon, for each 100-gram serving, approximately a serving size, 100 grams, has much fewer carbohydrates than Wonder Bread. So you're going to be better off. You're going to absorb that glucose into your system a little bit slower. Now, watermelon is not a great example of something you want to eat when you want some long-term brain power, right? Stick to something that's protein or vegetable-based, nuts, things that will give you a sustained glucose dispense into your brain. So those three things are the best that you can do to improve your cognition. You'll see more gains in sleeping, exercising, and eating properly than all the rest of this presentation combined. So if you don't have those things in line, it may not be worth it to try some of my more radical recommendations as we move on. Neuroscience, how does it work? Anyone? Yeah, not me so much. This is a disclaimer. On the left are neuroscientists. On the right is me. And in the middle is drunk liar me. I don't really know neuroscience. I don't have a degree in neuroscience. I'm a guy who sometimes spends his free time reading neuroscience studies on the internet, where everything is true, by the way. But the studies are generally pretty well sourced. I'm careful about that. So while I think that as a hobby it's a lot of fun to learn about these things, please take all of this with a heavy dose of salt. So the first bit that I want to explain, just a little bit about how your brain functions, is that this is your thalamus. The bit on the left is actually a large section of brain, but the stick is pointing to the thalamus down there in the center. And your thalamus sits in the center of your brain and is wrapped by your limbic system, the hippocampus and the amygdala, and your olfactory bulbs are all underneath your cortex, right, that sits there. So that's the core of your brain, the one that joins the two hemispheres down at the bottom. So the thalamus is the router for your senses, effectively. We know that when you see something or you hear something or you touch something, that signal is encoded literally into an electrical signal, right, that looks something like binary. They're able to like recreate these signals now actually for the optical nerve. You can generate an algorithm that describes what a baby's face looks like. There's a woman who's doing some fascinating science. There's a TED Talk about it. But that information comes into the thalamus and is sent back out to your brain for processing, right? So it comes into the router, goes back out to the brain, comes back to the thalamus, and then takes another action, right? So the important thing to remember there is that that's a loop, that the thalamus is a key part, a switching location for your brain. That without it, you're going to have some very serious cognitive impairment. But that learning happens throughout that entire process. Learning doesn't just happen in the brain in one specific location. We do know that you can create a memory artificially in a single cell and then destroy that cell and delete the memory. They've done that with mice. But we also know that changes cognitively happen throughout the brain as you're learning. So all the way along the inputs, it's as if in your computer, your hard drive was not where you stored your data, but you also stored it in your keyboard and in the cable to your keyboard and in your USB mouse, right? All of these locations are responsible for learning throughout your brain. It's an integrated system, unsurprisingly. So the hippocampus here is the top part of your limbic system. You've got these two halves of the hippocampus that run down around your paleomammalian brain. This is the lizard brain people refer to, responsible for emotion. And the hippocampus specifically plays a role in short-term memory, the conversion of short-term to long-term memory that was exposed by a patient called HM. Has anybody ever heard of this guy? The HM patient, yes? The HM is his initials. Honestly, I don't remember his full name now, which is an injustice, this poor man. But he had a surgery to relieve him of epileptic seizures. And part of that was destroying his hippocampus. So we used to just kind of muck about with this brain science stuff, right? And during amateur hour, HM had his hippocampus destroyed. And so he was forever unable to learn. For the rest of his life, he could not transfer anything from short-term into long-term memory. He remembered everything that had happened up until his surgery. He could recount events from his childhood perfectly clearly. But if you introduced yourself, you'd introduce yourself a couple minutes later. He couldn't safely go for a walk because he wouldn't remember where he lived or where he was, right? But perfectly amicable person carried on a relatively normal life for someone with such a debilitating condition. So that's a role that the hippocampus plays. Interesting note, when I was talking about which senses go through the thalamus earlier, I skipped smell. Your sense of smell does not go through your thalamus, strangely. Your olfactory bulbs connect directly to your hippocampus and travel down to your amygdala, your emotion center. And so there have been some studies around this, but the working theory is that olfactory memories are created in very distinct ways. There's a reason why sometimes you'll be walking down the street and smell apple pie and picture perfectly yourself standing on your grandmother's porch, right, with that pie in the window. Your ability to recall based on smell is not connected to typical routing mechanisms within your brain. So if you want to remember something, it's not a terrible idea to influence the smells that are around you, right? If you're going to study something for some grand test, anyone who wants to take the SATs for fun again someday, study with a little bottle of rose oil or something. See if you can recreate those scents. I think that you would be surprised how much it benefits you. And there are a lot of simple tests that you can do to test your cognitive ability at home with like lists of random words. We could write a random word generator, right, using the Faker gem and just show ourselves a list of words and try to remember them and test whether we're able to remember them or not. But I encourage you to do that kind of stuff. Science is not for laboratories, right? Science is for the people. Get out there and like, goof around with yourself, experiment a little bit. So the olfactory sense is fascinating to me because it just skips the whole routing system entirely. But I've talked a little bit about how we learn and neuroplasticity. I want to get into some specifics now, but when you learn, the important part is that the inputs act as places where learning can happen. The processing centers of your brain, right, your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, your executive functions, all of these places are places where learning can happen in your brain. Now, neurogenesis is restricted to some specific areas in adults. That's true. Mostly in hippocampal regions and in the limbic system. That's where you create new neurons in your body. It used to be we didn't think that was possible. We thought that the brain was a static, unchanging device that somehow wrote things down magnetically like a hard drive or something. Terrible way to store stuff. But we know a little bit more about it now. So there's a study called The Persistence of Long-Term Memory, a molecular approach to self-sustaining changes in learning-induced synaptic growth. A very long name. But the idea is that this gentleman named Kandel, Eric Kandel, shocked some California sea slugs who are kind of cute, I think, but unfortunately have very simple brains So they're great for shocking and then cutting apart and analyzing. Yeah, poor little sea slug. He just wants to be pink and float in the ocean. So the study that Mr. Kandel did was to take these cells out of a sea slug, and they're really popular because they do learn. You can shock the tail of a sea slug, and it'll have a gill retraction response. And over time, that response will last longer. So if I shock a slug for the first time, fool the slug once, it's the slug's fault, and then twice, not going to fool me twice, something like that. Bush said it right. I don't remember. So the longer that the slug receives these shocks, or the more frequently, the better they are at retracting their gills for longer periods of time. So you can train them to keep those gills retracted, and they think they're protecting themselves from the electric shock, which really they can't escape. Isn't it wonderful and cruel? So that they keep that gill response longer, sometimes days or weeks even. So that's how they test memory in sea slugs. And you're actually able to rip apart the sea slugs and take individual neurons into a bath of serotonin, and specifically doses of serotonin 1.5 hours apart 5 times, right? And they found that firing these neurons 5 times, 1.5 hours apart, was the more effective way to induce synaptic growth. So synaptic varicosities are those little bulby bits in the picture on the right. They grow and they engage. 2 different things happen when you learn something on a cellular level. You don't generate new neurons in every part of your brain, right? Just the limbic system generates new neurons. But the synapses on those neurons will change. So you'll develop new synaptic varicosities. Some of them that were dormant before, that lacked the chemicals to be effective neurotransmitters, will become active again. And you can even grow new ones. So I want to step back a second to the part I said about doing it 5 times. That's kind of interesting, right? That we don't just apply serotonin. We don't just fire this neuron and see an immediate change, right? We see a little bit of a change. But if we do it 5 times, 1.5 hours apart with a spaced repetition, we see a significantly improved response from those synaptic varicosities. So remember that. We're going to come back to that spaced repetition in a little bit here. Primacy and recency. I mentioned this earlier a little bit. Remember, this is the part of the conversation we're having that you're going to forget, the middle part, right? Human beings are remarkably good at remembering the beginning and the end of things that they're shown. So if I give you a list of 21 words, you will be much better at remembering the first 3 and the last 3 than you are any of the ones in between. In fact, this is a graph of that. Given a 30-word list, people will remember 60%, or well, 55, we'll say, % of those words from the first 5 words, and then we climb back up again for the last 5, given a list of 30 or 40 words. So the beginning of that is called the primacy effect. Last is the recency effect. It's just the way the human minds work. Things that are novel, right, or things that are recent are more memorable to us, right? So really interesting thing is that they did a study to try and amplify the primacy effect. So one thing we know that amplifies the primacy effect is exercise, right? 6 minutes of exercise after you try and learn something. They put people on a stationary bike for 6 minutes, right? Barely enough time to work up a sweat. Probably not. And they amplified that primacy effect. They were able to remember a higher percentage of things that they learned at the beginning of their word list. Another thing that helps is epinephrine. Has anyone ever used an EpiPen? Anyone who's allergic to peanuts has an EpiPen in their pocket right now? These are EpiPens. This will give you a large dose of epinephrine. Probably more than you need for this purpose. But if there's ever something you really need to remember, right? Epinephrine to the brain, all right? So the study that they did with this was a word list memorization study where they gave them that 21-word list, and they were able to amplify the primacy effect using an epinephrine injection, but not the recency effect. The recency effect was untouched, strangely. So more recent information is not as affected as information that you learned just a short while ago. Remember, think about this in terms of how long it takes someone to read a list of 21 words and memorize them, right? We might give you 5 minutes to complete the task. So not a long time in the past, but if you have a stress response, that's what these epinephrine and cortisol are, stress hormones, right? They will increase your memory consolidation. That same process that happens when you sleep happens much more quickly, but only for information you learned a short while ago. So things that are happening immediately may be forgotten. For example, if you see a bear, right, in the woods, and your body releases that fight or flight response, you remember the look of that bear and those berries that you were eating off of his bushes, or that baby bear you were playing with like a dummy, right? So this will help you remember not to play with baby bears or eat bears' berry bushes in the woods. But it won't so much remember what is happening while you're escaping from the bear, hopefully, right? Because it's less important for your survival. If you look back, from an evolutionary perspective, this makes sense, right? Things that we need to remember are the time that we ate those berries and then the bear almost ate us, not the time like everything was fine and we had some delicious berries, right? So another interesting loop that can happen with this, this reinforcement, right, these spaced repetitions. Learned helplessness, has anyone ever heard that term? It's a pretty common term. There were some really interesting studies done. They're, again, pretty cruel, as neuroscience is known to be. Learned helplessness is a real thing that happens to real people. It has symptoms similar to chronic clinical depression. The idea is that you are continuously affected by your reality rather than affecting your reality. And after time, you give up on the ability to change your reality. So they took dogs and they put them in cages with electric plates on the bottom. Terrible with this cute picture of a pug here to describe this study, but it was a cruel study. They put these dogs in these cages and they shocked the plates of the bottom of the cage at random. The dog didn't know how the charges were coming. They knew it hurt. They couldn't stop it, right? Getting shocked in these little cages. And after a while, they just give up and accept their fate. This is my new reality. I receive regular electric shocks. I'm in pain all the time. That's my life now. And so even when they opened the cages and gave them an easy avenue of escape, half the cage is removed, dog still just sits there on the plate. That's what their life is like. So there are a lot of people who live their lives like this every day, like here in America. It gives you some compassion for people who grew up in less favorable circumstances maybe than some of us did. But learned helplessness, a real thing, and it comes from that same reinforcement cycle. The brain can fight back against this as well. So remember that positive change happens the same way, right? If you speak positively to yourself, and when you typo something in your code, don't call yourself the biggest idiot that ever lived. Your brain is listening, even if you think that you're just joking. You'll learn these things. So signal more often to affect change. The more that you can repeat that input, right? In a way, this is not news, that you memorize things by repetition, right? This is the way we've been doing it for a long time. But specifically spaced repetition. You want to learn just as you're about to forget what you just learned. And I think the study was done at MIT where they came up with this algorithm to define those spaces. There's a site called Memrise that helps you teach or help you learn language that uses this technique. Where they will show you something, and things that you get wrong, they will show you again just before you would have forgotten that you had learned them, right? You learn the new thing, and then they show it just the right amount of time later. And they're amplifying this spaced repetition effect. So this is an app that I found that I used to memorize some things that, a POW deck that I'm going to talk about here in a moment. But Anki's a great little app, could use some open source contributions. I'm not sure, it's not written in Ruby. I don't even know what it's written in. But if any of you use that language, you should fix this app, because it could use some improvement. So the stuff that I was memorizing, I got from a book called Moonwalking with Einstein by Joshua Foer. Has anyone read this book? Yeah? Fantastic book. Definitely read this book. So Joshua was a journalist, and he was writing an article on the National Memory Championship. So he worked with a man named Ed Cook, who was a memory champion. There are people who do this full time, who study to memorize things. And they go and they have competitions, and they sit down and they'll memorize decks of cards, a dozen at a time, shuffle them, memorize the order of them in 20 minutes, and then recount them for fun and profit, right? So given that what we know about repetition and how repetition reinforces learning and teaches your brain to learn more effectively, right? These are some techniques that I think are worth addressing. So Josh, in this book, Moonwalking with Einstein, he addresses a couple things. One of those is synesthesia. Has anyone heard of that? Synesthesia is a pretty common term for people who see like an emotion will have a color, right? The crossing of senses. Maybe you hear something, you taste it at the same time, right? The assumption was that this was something unique to people, that there were certain human beings who were born with synesthesia and they were a gift to us. But the reality is that we're capable of this. People can learn this, synesthesia. You can teach yourself by creating these creative mental models. You've got to use your open mode a little bit, right? To create your own synesthesia. You can simulate that effect if you assign tastes and thoughts and smells, or imagine more vividly something that you otherwise would not have been able to. So one of the techniques that they use to do that is a memory training technique called POW, the person, action, object. So POW decks are essentially a list of images that you come up with, that you create for yourself, where you assign each two number combinations, 00 through 99, with a image of a person and an action and an object. For example, from my deck. 02, because it looks like OZ to me, reminds me of Ozzy biting the head off of Kermit, right? Or rather just biting. Biting the head off is a little too specific for a person action object deck. But Ozzy biting the head off of Kermit. This is an actual image that I found on the internet and is very easy to memorize if you've got a little Anki web program on your phone and you can just flip through your flashcards and teach yourself to associate these images with these numbers, right? So again, 02 from old Leet Speak days, OZ, as in Ozzy biting the head off of Kermit. I've got another one here I wanted to show you. This is our good friend Linus Torvalds giving the finger to NVIDIA. He was joking about NVIDIA's driver support for Linux. He doesn't really hate them that much. He looks really mad. But the 05 looks like OS, so how about an open source guy who also wrote an operating system? Oh my gosh, right? Amazing connections in my brain. So then we have Ice-T playing pinball in a kangaroo costume. Who knew that Ice-T was in a kangaroo costume ever? Has anyone seen that movie? Yes, Tank Girl! Awesome, all right. So the few of us who knew. So again, to review here, we've got 02, OZ, Ozzy biting the head off of Kermit, Linus Torvalds giving NVIDIA the finger. That's 05 here. And then we have Ice-T playing pinball in a kangaroo costume, right? So now if I were to ask you to remember this 6-digit number, this is about the limit of what humans can remember, 6 or 7 digits that we can hold in our short-term memory register, right? That's why phone numbers are shaped the way they are, right? So I ask you to memorize this, and it's possible that you'll just remember this straight away, right? But if I gave you 4 or 5 or 10 of these in series, it's much more difficult. So the point of a person action object deck is to be able to memorize this number with a single image, right? So if we take 06, which is Ice-T, right? And we take 05, which is giving the finger, right? And 02 to Kermit. We have Ice-T flipping off Kermit, right? Man, he is angry at Kermit. So 06, 05, 02 becomes flipping off Kermit, and suddenly we have one image. Images are much better for us to remember as human beings. Remember that written word and numerals are relatively recent innovations in the evolution of humankind. When you're looking at a number or a letter, you're memorizing that number or letter as a pictograph, right? Reading is relatively slow. We didn't recently, until recently, understand why it took us so long to read, right? That it's a really processing-intensive thing. That your whole life, you will never get over a certain number of words per minute in reading, no matter how much you read. People read their whole lives, right? This is pretty common. You'd think that we would have some way to push past that upper bound, but this is part of why. Is that our brains are not designed to process this. They're designed to process pictures of bears that are chasing us away from bear babies in the woods, right? By the bear bush. So Ice-T flipping off Kermit is a single image. And now if I were to give you 5 more of these, then you've got 6 images and a lot more numbers, right? You've got 30 numbers. You could memorize a 30-number string if you can keep 6 pictures in your head. And especially if those pictures are unique and unusual, like Ice-T flipping off Kermit, it becomes a lot easier. So the way that they do this in practice in a memory championship is you have a memory palace. You choose a place that's especially memorable to you. A lot of people use their original home where they grew up, maybe something that's more recent, your first company where you got a job, some physical space where you're able to walk the layout in your mind. And you'd be surprised how easily that you can do this. And then you'll place those images in loci around that space. So I could walk into the living room of my first home where I grew up back in Boulder, Colorado, and I could see Ice-T flipping off Kermit. And in fact, 6 other images easily held in that loci. It's quite common to hold 6 at a place, right? And then I could move into the kitchen, and I have another 6 images, and pretty soon, I'm memorizing pages of binary digits, right? Or entire decks of cards in a very short period of time. Joshua Foer actually won the USA Memory Championships in 1 year. He taught himself to do this. He taught himself a person action object system, and in studying how to do this, he became fascinated with it and went back to win the championship the next year for memorizing decks of cards. So let's say that Ice-T flipping off Kermit isn't quite your thing. There are some alternatives that I'm going to talk about. Again, this is getting more into the brain hacking territory. This is transcranial direct current stimulation, or brain zapping. Has anyone ever heard of this? Yeah? So you're actually applying an electrical stimulus to your brain directly. Sound safe for everybody? Yeah? Good idea, right? So the electrodes excite and suppress brain activity in that region. You increase the excitability of your neurons. They call it neuronal excitability, but you make those that specific patch of neurons where you apply the anode, right, the positive charge, you make that specific patch of neurons more active. They're more excitable. They fire louder on an fMRI scan, right? When you look at a functional magnetic resonance image of a brain that has just been receiving TDCS, then you see a brighter spot than you would if they had been receiving the cathode side, which suppresses. So anode will increase your excitability of those neurons, and the cathode side will decrease, right? So popular place to apply this technology. This is not a small thing, right? TDCS was used for a long time, but probably in the 70s we started experimenting with it. I mean, they did this in the 30s and like that, but we just barely knew what electricity was. It was very dangerous, right? In some cases, they hurt people. But more recently, we've been using this to impact the ability to learn and to increase memory uptake, especially the primacy effect, in all sorts of arenas. The Air Force and the Department of Defense use this to teach people. Air Force pilots who fly drones will use this to learn 2.5 times faster than their peers. So this is not small science. Like, yes, it's dangerous. It's a little bit fringe. I don't recommend you goof around with it. But there is some real science to back up this stuff. So the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex I want to talk about for a little bit, real common place where people apply this stimulus. This is the part of your brain that's responsible for executive functions. So working memory, problem solving, attention. This is the bit of your brain that is managing all the other processes, right? This is where you make a decision. It's in the front of your brain here. Your dorsolateral, if you just take your fingers on your cheekbones and run up right here, these 2 points on your brain, roughly, are where those executive functions come from. There are a lot of other interesting things that happen in the brain, right? And it's not that exact. But they know that you can increase the executive functions by applying an anode stimulus to one or the other side of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So here's what anodal stimulation and neuronal excitability looks like in your motor cortex on the side of your brain. This is the left side of your brain here. They applied an anodal stimulation to the center of the brain, right about here, on the side of the temple. And these are fMRIs from before and after. So you can see on the right side up top, this is someone who received stimulus from transcranial direct current stimulation, and below is someone who did not. So they actually lost some cognitive ability, as it turns out. That's the sham group. And so there has been some question about the effectiveness of sham electrodes in these studies and whether or not we're getting false data. So there have been some adjustments recently in how the shams are done, but basically what they do is they shock you for only a little bit. So you get the current because you feel it still. You're going to know as a patient that feeling of electricity running into your head. You can definitely feel it. Frequently people will get a phosphene, like a white electric flash in your vision when your optic nerve adjusts to processing new electrical input that comes from nowhere and learns to cut out the noise pretty quickly, which is fascinating that our nerve can do that, right? Like if you wear those glasses, the prism glasses that flip your entire world upside down long enough that your brain will start processing things the right way again, and then you'll take them off and just be ruined, right? You do go back to normal eventually, but the anodal stimulation and neuronal excitability, that's what the whole point of this, right, of TDCS. So it does have an effect, a measurable effect, and it's quite impressive, really. So there are some people on the internet who are into do-it-yourself TDCS. This is a terrible idea. Do not do this ever. Seriously, really bad idea. Applying an electrical current directly to your brain, right? Seriously, do not do this, right? So I actually brought my device here that I made with the help of my good friend, Michael Buffington, who also works at Living Social. He has better soldering skills than I do. So this is the device that we made, a couple of battery packs. I've got 8 AA batteries in here. This has 5 470 ohm resistors in a row. I'll show it to people who want to look at it. Nobody can try it, no. I don't want anyone to accidentally lobotomize themselves on my dime, but it's very safe, really. The output of this is, it's going to be fine. Don't worry about it. This little green light here will come on when I complete a circuit through my brain in just a moment. So now, the thing with this is that the placement of the electrodes matters, right? So I had to make my own electrodes. Amazon, don't ever order anything on Amazon that's not Prime because they don't ship when they say they will, a bunch of liars. But I've soaked these sponges that I made myself. You want a large space for your anode and your cathode. Again, don't do this. Seriously, bad idea. Soak it in saline solution, as much salt as you can dissolve in the water. Soak that sponge. That'll conduct electricity real well. And be really careful that it doesn't drip like into your eye so that you zap your cornea off or something. So you want to get this sponge right here on your head, right? And I'm actually going to plug my leads into these first. So this here is my little copper plate. I did the solder on the copper plates. That was the one contribution I had for soldering. So I plug my little copper plate into the back of the sponge here, and I've got my anode right here on my dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, right here, right? And in a minute, if I have a seizure or die or something, my wife's here in the 4th row. You guys should go comfort her. She's a nice lady. She doesn't deserve this. But so this is the cathode side here, and I'm going to put this one in here. And I'm going to put this on the side of my head, right over here, okay? It's not super precise, as it turns out. If you, because the sponge is so large, the idea is to distribute the current, diffuse the current over a large area. So you don't want to use like pinpoints because it will burn your skin kind of a lot. Well, I mean, it's not a lot. It's not going to cut a hole in your head or anything, but it hurts, right? Yeah. You want to diffuse the current as much as possible. So you'll see a little bit after this. I might have a little bit of a red sponge-shaped mark on my skull. So what I'm going to apply to my brain here is 2 milliamps of electrical current. And it's got a voltage regulator on here to make sure that it's always pushing 2 milliamps through my brain. So the voltage will go up and down to ensure that the current traveling through my brain, no matter what the resistance of my brain is, though some people's brains have higher resistance than others, they're a little bit thicker. So when I turn this on, let's see, where did I get my switches? This is really carefully planned, this whole thing. Nothing possibly could go wrong. Okay, I just saw a flash of light come across. Can anyone see the green light on? Yeah? So I saw a flash of light come across my field of vision. It's like a free fireworks display, right? It's practically drugs without any negative health benefit their effects that we know about. Yeah, it's totally working. I am way smart. I'm like that guy from Limitless right now. I can feel the clear pill in my blood. So the idea is that I am exciting neurons in this portion of my brain, right? My dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is more excitable now. And if I were to do this for about 20 minutes or 30 minutes, which is how long they normally do this, then I could begin learning immediately because I'm obviously stimming and excited about it right then. But the effects can last an hour, and they think that if you train regularly, you can increase that effect, the duration of that effect. Over time, you can learn to learn for an extended period, more excited frontal cortex. So the 2 side effects of this, one, like I said, redness under the electrode zone. That's why you want to use a nice big sponge. If you do this, and seriously, terrible, terrible idea. Don't do this. Especially don't tell anybody I told you about it. The other side effect is that phosphine, which is really kind of scary when you first see it, but after a while it's fun. It's like, oh, hello, phosphine, I remember you, right? So there's one last side effect that I want to address. This is me testing my device with the thumbs up here. Final side effect. Yeah, TDCS causes crazy eye a little bit, so watch out for that. If you get the crazy eye, don't come and knock it. It wasn't my fault. I told you not to do it. So thank you very much for hearing my talk. I want to ask anyone if they remember that number that I asked you to remember, the 6-digit. That's kind of a lot of people. Oh, that was totally easy. I already learned that already. Yeah, because of Ice-T flipping off Kermit, right? Thank you, Ice-T. I really appreciate it. My name is Jonan. I am Leapbot on Twitter. If you guys want to talk about brain hacking, let me know anytime. I'm always down. Thank you.